Okay, and we are live. Hügo Krüger, bye, welcome. Welcome to By the Horns. Good to have you, man.
Thanks a lot, Ricky. I appreciate the invitation, and thanks to your listeners for listening to me.
It's my pleasure. So I've come across your work in the last few months, and for me personally, just finding signal like this is rare. Finding someone who gets straight to the heart of the issue, like I find you have. You're clearly very well read. You write a lot. You articulate your ideas a lot. So I'm very excited for this discussion. I think people are going to be hearing a lot more from you in the future. So yeah, welcome to the show.
Oh, so thanks a lot for having me.
My pleasure. Hugo, do you mind giving us a bit of background about yourself before we jump into the topic?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from South Africa originally. I stay in France now. I'm also now a French citizen, so I'm a French South African. I became French citizen this year. So basically, I've got a background in civil engineering. I worked in South Africa for Lafarge at the time for about 2 years after completing my studies. I also worked in cell phone tower construction for about 6 months. So wasn't something major. And then I got to learn the coal business because the coal in South Africa, the fly ash, is used for various applications. My grandfather was actually one of the scientists that pioneered it in the country at the time. So he worked for the CSIR years ago. And that ash is in the Burj Khalifa. So anyway, the coal was my introduction into energy, sort of through him and construction. So I've always had an interest in both of them. Then, while working there, I studied French because Lafarge was a French company. And then one of the lecturers proposed a scholarship for South Africans who would like to study in France, and I applied for the thing. And at the time, they gave me the scholarship to come and do my master's. So at the time, I wanted to do it in cement, but I missed the enrollment for that university. And then I applied for a random degree in nuclear civil engineering without knowing too much about nuclear at the time. And then since then, I've worked in a variety of nuclear-related infrastructures. So I've worked on Hinkley Point, which is a big nuclear power station they're constructing in the UK. We did the design in Paris. I worked for French-Belgium company at the time. And then I worked at ITER, which is the International Thermonuclear Reactor, where they're attempting fusion in the south of France. We've also, in that office close to Marseille, we did a lot of what they call re-evaluation projects for Electricité de France, which is their version of ESCOM, on what they call external aggressions. Can a nuclear building still resist paleoseismic post-Fukushima events, nuclear safety, all of that type of stuff I did. And then my wife's Iranian, so she came back from Iran. She did a PhD in France, actually. She's a mathematician, and she went back. And then when she came back, she got a job in Paris. So I quit the job there and I came to Paris. And I've since then been working in the oil and gas industry. So I left nuclear for that to try and get a feeling to how something similar does it, but gas is very efficient. So I sort of became you can say, a armchair nuclear expert, not nuclear and energy expert. And I've now even been invited by people onto podcasts, and I've given a presentation to Free Market Foundation. They say I'm an expert. I don't know if I am. But yeah, that's more or less me.
You know, something that's missing in the discussion today, and it's gotten worse over the last few years, is the discussion of energy being the basis for civilization and for standard
Mm.
of living. In my opinion, our standard of living is driven by kilowatts. You know, how much power do you have available to you? That's the ability to get machines to do work for you, and if machines can do work for you, your standard of living can increase. And this is what makes nuclear such a phenomenal energy source because it's so energy dense, right? Like this is, correct me if I'm wrong here, but like this is way more energy dense by orders of magnitude than anything else we've got.
Yeah, but you see, I caution against something here. So first of all, yes, energy is the capacity for work, and the book I always recommend on this is Sir Anthony Wrigley's book, The Energy and the English Industrial Revolution. And he made the same conclusion that the Japanese actually made during the Meiji restoration of the Industrial Revolution. So the Westerners, we said it was property rights, free markets, rule of law, that democracy that allowed our societies to develop, which might be true. But if you read actually the communists at the beginning of the last century, Lenin in particular, Lenin had a statement, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something that if we uh, don't develop energy as a society, or electricity as a society, we stay a peasant society forever. There was some communist slogan. So the communists came to the conclusion through Das Kapital, which Karl Marx actually wrote, that the steam engine was what to call Marx the prime mover. So it's a capacity for work, and we can argue that wealth is just energy being dispatched in the economy. So everything is energy. Your house behind you was there's a scraper that built it. It was constructed. There's potential energy. It's an aeroplane is It's got energy to move around. So everything uses energy, and you can argue that GDP per capita is actually low entropy fuel. Now, what does low entropy mean? It's energy that's not been disturbed yet. And that's why, if you follow the logic to that, you come to the conclusion that's why coal was so sufficient during the Industrial Revolution. That's why fossil fuels are so efficient, because you can just put it everywhere and apply. Now, nuclear has got a weird conundrum where it's energy dense, which is true, and it's got a lower form of entropy actually than coal, because the energy that went into coal actually comes from nuclear, geothermal energy derived from nuclear. Some people say the Earth's a nuclear reactor, others say it's from the Big Bang. Okay, whatever your view is. So it's the basis of the energy that decayed, and that energy that's stored in coal, in one way or another, came from nuclear. But then you have this weird conundrum: why is the cost of nuclear then said to be expensive if it's got this energy density favor, and it's also got the material density favor, use fewer materials? And it actually comes down to the materials. If you're from the science, why it's true that nuclear is energy dense, we still struggle to exploit its full thermodynamic potential. And that is because you still need water to make a turbine, to run a turbine to generate electricity, and to contain the water, the nuclear pipes have to be 300 degrees, and that's to maintain the boron. So there are other reactions and other factors that limit us from fully exploiting it. Of course, that's only the pressure water reactor. There are different types of reactors, but they all have their own constraints. There are physical constraints to exploiting it fully. So you're right to have an intuition to say that, yeah, okay, it's energy dense, but it's the same mistake people would make by saying, but protein content determines food prices. It does to a point, but then you get to a point where you just eat in a restaurant, and why is one more expensive than the other? And that comes to subjective value, to services, to other things, right? So nuclear also has its limits, but it certainly has different potentials and hasn't been fully exploited yet.
I suppose the other thing of nuclear is it requires massive centralization. You've got to build a big nuclear power plant to extract the energy. It's not like coal that you can. Well, I suppose coal's got a scale factor to it as well, but you just can burn the coal and generate energy. It's not that you have to split the atoms apart like you do with nuclear. So nuclear requires like scientific investment, and it's much more. It's further down the line than in terms of technological development than burning coal. But nevertheless, nuclear obviously has a lot of potential, and places like France, where you live, run, I'm not sure the percentage, but a high percentage of France's energy comes from nuclear, versus South Africa, where it's a small percentage because we only have one nuclear power plant. What is it though that is? I mean, we saw a massive uptick in nuclear power plant production, people building plants, obviously when they discovered the technology. Um, I don't know if I'm right or wrong on this, but it would seem like nuclear production is tapering off, and they're not really building that many nuclear power plants anymore, or at least there's strong opposition to it. And why do you think that there is that opposition?
So there's two things that there's a few things that came together. First of all, the first application of nuclear was the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in particular, in Western countries, the political left, particularly in Germany and the United States, was highly opposed to it. So there was a countercultural movement in the 1980s that came to oppose it. And then came 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and that just sort of strengthened their arguments. But it actually predates that. It comes down to the first Earth Day protest. And I've even spoken to Patrick Moore, who is the founder of Greenpeace, that changed his view. The first protest of the environmental movement was against the hydrogen bomb. So there's always been this cultural fear to it. And when humans are scared of stuff, we tend to impose safety regulations onto it. Simultaneously, in the 1930s, there was actually an excitement about nuclear when Marie Curie and these people discovered it. And there was new reactors being built, and lots of creativity into that field, because there were no regulations at the time. Now, then around the 1950s, the United States government, this was General Eisenhower in particular, looked into the effect of radiation fallout on the population, because opposition to atomic bombs during the Cold War was rising. Okay. And in particular, they looked into Nevada and Utah. Now, in Nevada, they dropped 12 atomic bombs, and there was a population, particularly the Mormons next door, who were exposed to the radiation fallouts. And there were questions being raised: are they going to get cancer? Are they going to get sick? What are we doing? And Eisenhower constituted what was called the Bears Committee, and this committee was staffed by geneticists who were surprisingly linked to the ominous-sounding Rockefeller Institution. And there's a lot of speculation there, but they came then to accept the safety standard of radiation, saying that every single dose of radiation is dangerous, which is just absurd because a banana is radioactive, and they called this standard linear no threshold. And since then, that standard itself has affected the cost and the knock-on effect. Because you just impose safety regulations on a technology, you increase the risk. And then private investors would say, I'm not going to take that risk. I'm not going to spend $200 billion that Japan spent after Fukushima, for example, even though they should probably not have done it. And then there's also just the social psychological effect. You can't see radiation. People don't know it. You need a high understanding of what it is. So all of that adds to the perception of risk. And my view, the cost is driven by the perception of risk. Also, the 73 oil crisis played a role here, where the United States hiked interest rates. Nuclear's got large plants, as you said, they need low interest rates. So that sort of chased a lot of engineers out of the industry. And since then, the industry hasn't recovered in the US. But surprisingly, if you look at Russia, China, and Iran even, and now India. India is building at $2,000 a kilowatt hour. The US historically was 3,000, and now at 10,000 in the States. So the Indians got 1/5 the cost. Some countries still have the cost of nuclear under control. I would say it's a more or less competitive with coal if you do it proper, if you do it right. I don't think it is as cheap as the proponents argue, but certainly there's a business case from it if you buy it from the right country and if you build it in the right country. And I thought a lot about this question, but I think it comes down to the culture of fear, because the regulations don't change that much between countries, but it's how they're being applied and interpreted, and sort of the culture of courage. Are we scared of nuclear or are we not? That comes with it.
Do you? I mean, I understand what you're saying about people being scared, but do you not think that that the fear is being driven in a certain direction by certain actors that are
Yeah.
anti-nuclear?
Well, if you take it, nuclear historically came from utilities. Utilities always had a captured market. Eskom had a captured market until until they really perform. I mean, you have to perform badly before people start asking for alternatives, right? And Eskom is the good example of that. But generally speaking, they're a captive market. So they never saw the need for advertising, for communicating to the public. And that made them vulnerable to attacks. Where, in contrast, the oil industry historically has been private driven investors. And they were throwing money left, right, and center in ads, in anti-nuclear propaganda, if you will. In Australia, the coal industry was opposed to it historically. So there's a lot of interest. I mean, it's difficult to say who exactly is pushing it. And then also the environmentalists were pushing it. The political left in the United States at one stage had the long march through the institutions. So I had a list at one stage of all the interest against nuclear power, but it's quite extraordinary. And then there's also
Yeah.
the fact that there's no real grift in the nuclear industry. The oil market annually is $4 trillion. During an oil shock, it goes up to 6. Nuclear is 600 billion. The cow dung market in India is bigger than the nuclear market. So you've got a small market already that is susceptible to attacks, that saw no need historically to communicate to the public. So of course it's going to happen.
Yeah. And I mean, I saw this stuff firsthand. We were speaking off air about it. I studied at Stellenbosch and I was in the botany and zoology department. And we went to the Fynbos Forum in St. Francis in 2011. And Taspint is that nuclear site that Eskom owns that was down. People think it's in Jeffreys Bay, but it's actually near Cape St. Francis. And the Fynbos Forum was right there. And we had a bunch of leading academics at this forum, and all of them were rabidly anti-nuclear. Obviously, because they were all the botanists and the zoologists. And they effectively managed to lobby and play a part in shutting down the nuclear deal that was happening in South Africa. And the area I grew up in, my family home is another site where there's a nuclear site, Bantam's Klip, which is out between Pearly Beach and Gansbaai. And another site that got shut down where we should have had 3 nuclear power plants by now. We still only have 1. So the environmental lobby is very strong against it. I've seen firsthand.
Yeah, and the environmental lobby, I did an interview with Ken Braun from the Capital Research Institute. They get, the institutions are staffed with $2.3 billion annually, which is the cost of finishing the pebble bed, by the way. Okay, now, that doesn't all go for anti-nuclear stuff, but you just do you really have to throw that much money at a technology if there's no business case for it? I mean, you're really desperately trying to do so. And the interesting thing, South Africa shows this to me. So I've looked at opinion polls in the country, and it's, I've sort of put my finger on it, but if you look at the Afrikaners, they tend to be okay with nuclear, roughly in favor. Some are against, but mostly in favor. The black population is overwhelmingly in favor at the moment, and so the colored and Indian population. But if you go to the English-speaking whites, who tend to starve Stellenbosch these days for weird reasons, they tend to be opposed to it. And they're the guys who often get their power from nuclear in Cape Town, right? So there's a strange sociological phenomenon. It's not driven by rational debate because the deaths of nuclear per kilowatt hour is more or less the same. The cost depends how you price it, but yeah, it might be a bit more expensive than in solar and wind. But that's if you accept the levelized cost for intermittency can be compared to base load, but it's by and large on par with coal. And if you do it properly in mass production, you can actually get it down. And then the other benefits, if South Africa were to build it, we don't take the construction risk. So that extra cost is not on our balance sheet. I've never seen that being debated in the public. It's just nuclear is bad, the Russians are coming. And then also the
Yeah.
anti-Russian propaganda is played in the
Yeah.
backdrop of it, as if Russia's the only country that builds it.
Exactly. Right, exactly. En I do apologize for my people. That's why ek praat maar Afrikaans baie sodat mense weet ek is nie heeltemal Engels nie. But I do apologize for the Anglo in Cape Town. They make very bad decisions all the time. But it is what it is. But look, we love putting a solar panel on our roof and then feeling good about it. But yeah, look, it is a head scratcher, and like you say, it's not just Russia that can supply these nuclear power plants. I mean, the French built Coburg, South Korea is building very, like you're saying, very cost-effective nuclear power plants. The Indians are doing it. You've got a whole bunch of different suppliers to choose from, and maybe can you delve in a bit more into this about how you structure the deal so that you don't take the cost risk as a country?
Yeah, so it's basically like building your house. I mean, if you're ever going to build your house, you tell the builder to put part of the money down. He takes a risk as well. So there's compliance. So if these people doesn't perform, he fires them and he gets a better manager, right? And it's the same point. So what they call vendor financing is simple. The risk is split between both parties. Now, the ratio depends on the deal. But generally speaking, 85% of the money comes from the vendor country. So a good example of this was when Finland recently built the EPR. The French were building it, and they did go over budget. But the French pensioners absorbed that risk. So it was better split between the two parties, and then both sides didn't get hurt. Ideally, obviously the French didn't make money, but they said we protected our industries because of this. It was the Russians are even prepared to cover sometimes the entire cost, and you only pay them back in tariffs, especially with the boats that they're doing. The South Koreans in Dubai, I think Dubai put up a greater proportion than the South Koreans. But the point is, the risk is split between both sides. And what's very important to me is if South Africa is going to embark on a nuclear mass build, I don't think we should go for mass build because there are risks. I don't think we can manage it that well. But one or two power stations over, say, a decade or so, just make sure that if there's overruns, you have construction penalties, and you say, look, guys, you made a mistake. You said you'll fix it, and that's your problem, South Korea, Russia, or America, whoever builds it. And that's how we should structure it. And if you look at the countries with a good track records, the US and France at the moment don't have one. So obviously you would evaluate a tender and saying, does the contractor have a good record in the last 10 to 15 years? And you eliminate those who can't build it on time, and you just accept from the better people. So it's like building anything, really. It's just basic contract management. And again, you don't see this being debated.
Yeah. So who are the world leaders in terms of reliability, in terms of cost? Who's the best at building
China,
nuclear power
South
plants
Korea,
at
and
the moment?
Russia at the moment. And then India is in their own country, but they're not in the export market yet, but they're soon to be. So I would say South Korea is a quite attractive one for South Africa because there was 150 South Africans in Dubai building that one. They had issues though with IP with the US, but I actually saw today that they won a court case that they can keep the IP. So South Korea is building cheaper than Russia. I haven't seen that being mentioned as well. So it just seems to be a no-brainer if you've had South Africans working on that plant and you get it back home. But again, I put the tender out, and then there's obviously geopolitics involved, which is often the decision. What maybe the Chinese with BRICS is a more attractive option. Chinese are building quite affordable in Pakistan at the moment. There's suspicion that they might absorb the costs with their state because we're skeptical if you can build that cheap outside of your own country. They claim they can. But that's not our problem in South Africa. If they offer us a good price, you take the good price, right? It's like buying a car. It's not my fault if Toyota made a mistake on the spreadsheet. So the buyer-seller distinction is not made.
Yes. Okay, but now a cynical South African person would say to you, okay, but look at Medupi and Kusile. They are like, Lord knows how many years overdue and 5x over budget, and they're not producing anywhere near what they should be producing.
Yeah,
how do you avoid that?
Well, first of all, you don't do what you did in Medupi and Kusile. So let's see how that happened. In 1998, when Eskom warned the government we need to build more power stations, government didn't listen. So they instructed Eskom at the time to fire their planning office and their civil engineers. So when they rebuilt Medupi and Kusile, they had one or two civil engineers and one guy was out of university. So what do you expect was going to happen with those contracts? And then they structure the contracts idiotically. So back in the apartheid years, we could build ourselves because we had this mass build program. But because for 10 years you don't build, people left the industry. So they had to rehire those contractors. And then they put out the contracts in a way that government would take the risk and pretend that there's not going to be overruns. It's the dumbest way to manage a contract. So they did everything wrong to incentivize corruption and theft, and then there was just actual theft. But
Yeah.
if we send out a tender for South Africa, I mean, if the contractual conditions are the same as with even Kusile, I would say obviously not. But if it's
Mm.
done in a way where it's properly structured, like Kuberg was built in the past, yeah, sure. And let's assume it
Yeah.
goes 2 or 3 years over budget. It's not our problem. In the contract, they should
Yeah.
absorb that risk.
Yeah. I mean, you're saying things that sound reasonable, but just from the cynical South African perspective, we've seen so many unreasonable things
Yeah.
happen in our country by the government controlling things that but that is what it is, I suppose.
Well, the other thing why I would say it's not popular in the media is it's very difficult for middlemen to get into the deal because of the way the contracts work. Because there's 5 vendors, you just phone every five, one of them say, how much does it cost? There's no middleman. It's 5 calls. Theoretically, they can send a brown envelope to a minister, but you can do that for anything. I don't see how you can stop that basically. And like a car power ship
Yeah.
that donates what is it, a reserve or something.
Yeah.
That type
Yeah.
of stuff can probably happen. I mean, I don't dispute.
Of course.
I mean, I understand people's skepticism to this thing. Do we need it in South Africa? Well, I would say, I mean, there's obviously don't need anything, right? But I would say South Africa's now had repairs, refurbishment at Kuberg. It went relatively well, but yes, there were delays and cost overruns. But it's going
Mm.
to run for another 10 to 20 years. We have a semi-skilled staff there. Let's build another one. I won't say let's go overboard. And why would I say another one? Then all those old guys who worked on the pebble bed and stuff that are about to retire or have retired already can transfer some of their skills. You've got a few more guys in the country then. And then when the SMRs, the small modular reactors, come online in the next 5 to 10 years, and they've already been licensed, so it's not theory that I'm speaking of, we
Yeah.
have some skills in the country to license them. What I caution again is us trying to build everything and us trying to manufacture the parts and the components. That's going to result in another Kusile and Medupi. So
Yeah.
it's a acceptable risk when we're under certain conditions, and then the cost can be more or less what Kuberg costs, I think.
Yeah. So I highly recommend people to go and listen to the interview you did on the Power Hungry podcast if they want to get a bit more into detail on the nuts and bolts of all of this stuff. And because we don't have time on today's episode, but yeah, fascinating what you discussed there on that episode. But so in terms of nuclear fuels, you just mentioned the pebble bed and the small modular reactors, the SMRs. What does the future of nuclear look like in terms of fuels, in terms of new designs, etc.?
Well, there's more or less 3 types of designs that I'm optimistic about. There are others as well, and I might be wrong. The first one is just a smaller pressure water reactor, so a smaller version of Kuberg. Um, it's relatively safe, and the advantage is private investors can get in because the big plants have these major, they need state capital at this stage. Um, the other one is the pebble bed, which is a gas-cooled reactor. You can do it not just with helium, but with nitrogen, with carbon. There's other types of gases, and they all have technical challenges that I think R&D is still necessary. But I believe in America they're moving fast with it, and it's actually South Africans managing it with X Energy, and the Chinese have licensed one already, so they're probably going to sell it soon. Gas-cooled reactors have the advantage is you can put them where there's no water, because South Africa's got air-cooled coal, so we can replace those plants. And then the one I'm actually most excited about is the molten salt reactor. And there's Danish companies, 2 of them, Copenhagen Atomics and Seaborg. And then there's one in Canada, which is called, I think it's Moltex, if I'm not mistaken. And the advantage of that one is actually a battery. It can load follow, so it can load respond. You can actually store the excess solar and wind and potentially make that work and decarbonize. Or you can just have nuclear working, and then because the salt is a battery, if you think of it.
Yeah,
So
so you melt the salt, and then that stores heat for a long period of time, and that's used to boil water, right, or create steam.
yeah,
Is
it's
that
like
the working principle
I don't
behind
know
it?
if you know concentrated solar uses
Yeah,
salt as a
yeah,
storage. It's the same principle,
yeah,
except you can replace that salt with uranium and thorium salts. So it can actually generate power on its own, and it can stop. And you can just couple it to a turbine, and then it uses the heat when necessary. And that way, you've got a small a battery in an area, because the battery storage problems are big question marks over the renewables. Will the lithium iodide batteries fall by another fact? I think they have to fall by a factor of 6 to be basically push every other technology out of the window. And we don't know yet. That's the answer.
And are the uranium and thorium salts also mined by small Congolese children with their bare hands, like lithium is and cobalt is?
Well, we can manage it in South Africa. By the way, I think that story is also blown out of proportion a little bit. But yes, no, I mean, I don't know what I mean. Uranium mines in South Africa historically, if you mine gold, you mine uranium with it. And we've got mine dams in Carltonville where there's uranium everywhere and it's radioactive and kids are playing there. And by the way, nothing's wrong with them. I think this idea of radiation being dangerous is absurd. But
is that in the East Rand?
West Rand, Carltonville's
West
West
Rand.
Rand.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay, because you might be wrong about something not being wrong with them, but we'll leave that for another discussion.
Yeah, but anyway, so just a point on radiation.
That's not the radiation.
Yeah, just a point on the radiation. This linear no threshold model I spoke about earlier says that every dosage of radiation is dangerous, but we now have good epidemiological evidence from the atomic bomb survivors, from Chernobyl, from all these accidents that it's actually beneficial to you. So your accidental risk might come into proportion a little bit. We call that radiation hormesis. And this is what the environmentalists really hate when I say this to them, because they say I am justifying murder and child leukemia and all these things. But the correlation between, for example, leukemia and radiation is debunked. The idea that plutonium is toxic is complete nonsense in low quantities. Radiation is not as dangerous in low quantities. I mean, high-end radiation is going to kill you, right? But so in other words, if there's an accident theoretically and a population has 2 or 3 CT scans equivalent, nothing's going to happen to them. They're fine.
Everything has a dose response curve. There's no such thing as like an absolute tiny amount, being toxic and then increasing. There's a dose response curve.
That's what I am arguing. Yeah, that's what I'm arguing.
Yeah.
That we should change all our environmental laws on that basis. But you see, radiation law assumes precautionary principles, which is nothing ever safe. Now, it just makes no sense because your Wi-Fi is your 5G is radioactive, things of that sort.
Yeah, the sun is radioactive, like solar radiation. We're getting radiation all the time.
But you see, this is part of the dogma. Is the part of the fear came from the fear narrative started with McCarthy actually. Joseph McCarthy basically attacked Oppenheimer, these people, and they made the public believe that every dosage of radiation is dangerous for you. Even though we gave kids radon toys in the 1930s, and Marie Curie and them were working with plutonium and uranium, their bare hands, things of that sort, and they obviously didn't die. So it's clearly not as dangerous.
Yeah. And what about the different fuel types? So obviously we know uranium and plutonium as fuels for nuclear power reactors. Is there anything else on the horizon for different types of fuels?
Well, so if you mix uranium with plutonium, you create what they call MOX fuel. That's what France is using in the reactors. That reduces the amount of uranium burnt. It makes it more efficient. Then you also have thorium. You can mix. Thorium is not fissile on its own, so it needs a little bit of uranium to kickstart it, but that reduces the amount of uranium and enrichment. And then you need to take into account the Canadian and the Indian reactors. They use natural uranium and not enriched uranium because they run on heavy water. And heavy water is a better moderator, so you don't need enrichment. And so Canada did that to not make atomic bombs. So there are other ways of skinning the cat here. Those are principally the fuels. Then there's also waste. Moltex is looking into encapsulating waste as a fuel. And if you take, I think it's alpha or beta emitters, I can't remember, one of them is totally harmless to humans. So you can actually put it in your house in a small reactor, but that's far away. And then you can imagine the greenies are not going to be happy about that. And everyone's got a small little heat pot at home. But that's feasible technically. So yeah, there are applications for the waste, and there's actually an economy in the waste. It's not waste; it's spent fuel, and it's some of it is valuable. It's like a gold mine. So we need to just figure out what to use them for, medical applications, things of that sort.
Yeah. And some of the newer generation reactors, like you just mentioned, are they using spent fuel from previous generations as fuel sources now, or does that all just go into a concrete bunker and get kept there forever?
So the French reactors use the MOX fuels already. The talks of the US doing it. Russia was actually leading in this market. Now the US wants to take back the market. They're investing into fuel again.
Yeah.
In terms of waste, I believe Bill Gates's reactor is trying TerraPower. I think it's a sodium-cooled reactor. They're trying to use that to exploit it. But the thing with waste is, I'm a bit skeptical if you can use all of the waste as fuel, because you get it to a point where your level of enrichment goes up. And then you get into issues with the non-proliferation treatment. And then just take into account, after Fukushima, the price of uranium crashed by like 70%. So the economies of using the fuel was just not there. Just better to
Mm.
sometimes to put something in a hole. And it's like recycling. It sounds great until you start looking at the costs, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly, exactly. And just in terms of how much fuel a nuclear reactor uses or a person would use, I mean, I've seen, I don't know how true it is, but I've seen infographics of a person, if you took all of your energy consumption, if it was all coming from nuclear power, you would use like a Coke can of fuel in your entire lifetime.
Yeah.
Um, is that true?
But I'm not sure it measures per person, but if you take Kuberg, for example, all the waste is half a tennis
Yeah.
court after 40 years.
Oh, wow.
That's
Half a
nothing.
tennis court. And that's all in the fall pits there up in the Northern
Not
Cape,
all. So the
basically
low
in
end
the hole.
waste at fall puts the high end spent fuel. I'm not going to say waste because then people get scared. It's
Mm,
stored on site.
sure.
It's welded in a dry cask storage that weighs 200 tons. You can't put it in the boot of your car.
No.
It's just you need to steal a crane to steal it. Basically, who wants to do that? And
Yeah.
then the reason we haven't moved it to fall pits yet is because it's not economically viable yet because waste decays, and
Mm,
because there's that decay function, it actually gets cheaper to kick the can down the road. It's a
mm,
negative interest
I
rate.
see.
So South Africa was
Yeah.
clever, and the International Atomic Energy Agency would allow for the trade in waste, which is now heresy. We can take fault bits. We can say, come and store your waste. We put that in the bank. We earn interest on that account, and then the
Yeah.
waste burns itself out, and you become a very
Yeah.
rich country. So waste treatment is actually a lucrative business if you just get the proper business model.
And how much storage capacity have we got at fall pits? Right.
We've got enough for another 6,700 reactors last time I calculated, which is theoretically okay.
How many reactors are there in the world?
I'm not sure, but I worked out it's something for like South Africa is fine for the next like 10, 15,000 years. So we're okay. There's no issue for us.
Yes, those Buddha, they planned in
But
advance.
look, I won't be
Yes.
surprised if the apartheid military carried some of the cost at the time, but it's paid off. So
Yeah.
we've got the thing,
Yeah.
and just what we need don't have yet is a deep waste depository, and there's talks now of building it. I'm not sure how much that will cost, but I don't even think that's necessary. I just really think put the
Sure.
thing in a can and then pay a few guards until the end of time, or don't even pay them. Who's going to steal that stuff? I mean, if you,
No, no one. No,
yeah,
definitely. Okay, well, there's a topic I want to jump into, and that is the unit economics of a nuclear power plant. Obviously, you build this baseload power with a nuclear
mm,
power plant. They don't really like to spool up and spool down. You produce baseload power, but your demand curve from your general economy, that obviously changes throughout the day and throughout the year. So
yeah,
you've got these like peaks and troughs that don't always match up. So with a nuclear power plant, that base load that's being produced at certain times of the day, you've got a big surplus of power that's presumably going nowhere. And maybe you could explain to people what happens to power in the grid that isn't consumed immediately. Um, am I right in saying it just gets vented into the ground, right? We just literally
Well,
waste it.
usually you pump water or you vent it. Um,
Yeah,
pump storages for that purpose. You see, that's why I don't think South Africa should have 100% nuclear.
sure.
France did this in the 70s and 80s, and they built too many power stations. They didn't know what to do with them. It was actually sunken
Yeah,
cost for some of them. But then the Europeans put interconnectors, and now they actually supply baseload to Europe. So baseload, I would say your nighttime demand, you can easily match with nuclear. Maybe not all of it, maybe half of it,
mm,
and then it's constant. Otherwise, you're
mm.
pumping water. But there's people who say that they can use that for hydrogen production or for other things. So you can make stuff with it. Whether that's
Well, so
economical, I
the
don't know.
the case I would make is that we should be mining Bitcoin with it. And this is where
Yeah.
the Bitcoin miners get involved, right? Because you don't have to distribute that electricity. You don't have to send it anywhere. You can consume it on site and you can turn it into a financial battery. So you've got a guaranteed buyer for your asset, or for your product, which is the Bitcoin network. They'll buy any hash rate you can supply. They'll take everything you can give them, and then the price of Bitcoin mining, obviously, or the money you receive for mining when you sell your Bitcoin, that is a global market, so that's globally competitive. So that's always there's pressure driving it down. So you're not making a huge amount of money out of it, right? Um,
Yeah.
but you have a buyer of last resort. Um, and what I've seen happen in the States now is a couple of projects where guys are doing nuclear with Bitcoin mining integrated. Have you come across any of these?
So I don't know anything about the States, but I do know this, that there was, I think, I can't remember if it was Ukraine or Iran. I don't know why I'm confusing with those two countries. There was one guy who almost used all the power of a nuclear plant, and there was a deficit in the country at one stage for his Bitcoin mining. So there's certainly been experiments with that. So you need to look into that one. I need to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the difference though is that if you're mining and you're just pulling power off the grid, um, that's a different story. If you're just running your own Bitcoin mine, but if you are actually the one who's running the power plant, so a company that's running the plants and they're selling power back to the grid. So I use America as an example because they've got
Hmm.
the free market system for power there. It it could change the unit economics quite substantially because when they're modeling this out, they're not assuming 100% of that 100% of their power is being purchased all the time, right? They're assuming a waste factor.
Well, you've got what they call the busbar rate or the levelized cost of electricity, which is basically it's a cash flow model. And you say, I need to sell at $50 per kilowatt hour, whatever it might be. Okay. And if the market price of electricity is more or less than that, I run at loss or a profit. And then at the end of the
Mm.
year, you calculate all of that. So you obviously put some contingency in. And then obviously in my business model, I would say, what if there's a geopolitical shock? What if there's X, Y, Z? So if I can say there is a dedicated buyer, I go to a Bitcoin miner and I say, I've got a nuclear plant, this is my contract. And whenever there's excess, you agree to buy it at the strike price. So I break in at least. That might be a business model.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
that makes sense to me. I mean, you would still feed into the national grid because
Absolutely.
the contract with national grid is as a Bitcoin as a new operator. I don't want my plant to stop because when it stops,
No.
you damage the plant basically. So there's a
Yeah.
potential of structuring contracts that way. I mean, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So you could, for example, say I'm gonna install 5% of my product of my capacity of Bitcoin
Yeah.
miners. So at the maximum draw of my miners will be at 5% of what I can produce. And then I know at least I can offset that amount because I'll have a guaranteed buyer for my power. So then whenever you've got your lowest demand, you can spin up your Bitcoin miners. And then when retail demand or industrial demand goes up again, you turn off your miners and you pump that power back to the grid because you get a
Yeah,
higher
if
price for
you
it
can use your
selling it there.
Bitcoin miners as a heat sink basically, with an electrical
Yeah.
sink, and that
Yeah. It's
makes
a
sense.
load
It's like a
balance.
pump storage. That's
Mm.
actually what we need, because
Yeah.
pump storage is just water
And
being pumped for nothing, right? And you gravitate it down during the
yeah,
days. So Bitcoin don't gravitate down, but you
exactly.
switch off. So it's you reduce amount. Yeah,
What it also does is it gravitates to your pocket because you become a much you become a much more financially viable entity.
exactly.
Yeah, and you can isolate yourself from geopolitical shock as well. It becomes very interesting, and this is where the renewable side of things isn't so it's not so attractive for Bitcoin miners, because the power is so intermittent and you can't really
I need to
model
join for
it.
my next chat, by the way, if you don't mind.
Right. We got
Okay.
2 minutes left. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna have to cut it short there.
Okay.
Quickly before you go, where can anyone find you? Your
So
Substack,
they can
etc.
find me Substack. It's Hügo's newsletter, or you can find me on Twitter or on YouTube with my name Hügo Krüger. And yeah,
Great.
thanks.
I'll add them all in the links below.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time, and we'll
Okay.
chat again soon, man.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Cheers.
Have have a great evening. Cheers.